good informative aspect. When I say we have turned the corner as a state into investment, this is what we're talking about. Is we have got to the size of a fund that for sustainability over time, that if we appropriately protect it, that we will continue to do so. And so that's where the overall growth aspect is when we look at that. So as far as FY24 budgetary highlights, and I think I see we've got a senator in the room who is actually, you've done a great job, Senator. She controls my budget. And we've got them on the line. But again, we want to note it's the first time since 1982 that the House concurred with the Senate budget. There was a lot of things that occurred at the end, but we did have a PFD that was based, a dividend that was based on a roughly 75-25 model. 75 to PMV towards state government, 25 towards the dividend aspect. For intents and purposes, if you're doing base calculations, it's about 630,000 Alaskans get the dividend. And so you can use that math per dollar amount. So it's about $900 million, which was used towards the dividend this year. And so we also had a $175 million increase to the state for funding formula. And this all came out to about a $6.2 billion budget, excluding federal funds. And so this is where we're at with the planned savings of about $84 million surplus under the forecasted dollar oil barrel rates. So for FY25, it is an ongoing process. The governor has a constitutional responsibility to release a budget by December 15th. We do have a brand new director of the Office of Management and Budget, Lacey Sanders. If you guys haven't met her, she's fantastic. She took over for this role in an interim aspect in 2019 when the first OB director left for Governor Dunleavy. So we're really glad to have her in this role. She's getting her budget guidance out to the departments, and we're starting our individual. We've been working on our budget presentation, but as Cheryl knows, it's a long iterative process. You start well in advance. We did. July 1 comes, you do end of year closeout, you do management plan for FY24, then you do reapproach, then you do budget development, then you do your budget presentation, and it's a never-ending cycle when you're looking at your government budgets. So as we look at this, the key items to remind is that FY25 is $3.656 billion. This is the number that we know as of July 1 based upon our overall returns. We just finished the financial year for the permanent fund, and we actually had our audited financials at the last meeting last week. And so this is the number that we got. We know it officially. It's slightly different. So this is different than the spring forecast. So I want to make sure I highlight that because this is what the actual returns came back as. So the POMV is the first 5 of the last 6 years. And so we do know where those numbers are going to hit. And this was the number that the CIO, the Chief Investment Officer for the Crum Fund Court, Marcus Frampton, presented last week. So POV of 3656. We do projected oil revenue for futures at $70 a barrel based on 497,900 daily barrels production of ANS. That makes us at $2 billion. On top of the non-petroleum revenue projected at 496, this gives us a ground total of $6,159 million. So this is the baseline that we are using for the FY25. These are the public numbers which are out there for discussion. As we've talked about, right, oil is high right now, but oil does vary. It depends on, we know that over time. But this is the numbers that we have to discuss this. We're not going to release the RSV until it gets closer until the budget release date. The RSV is what the ERG group, the Economic Research Group at tax, continues to look at. It's the really robust long-term forecast. It's longer windows and snapshots in time of all of our investment and return and revenue items. And so it's a very robust document. I'm sure this group has dove into it. It's something that all Alaskans should look at to see what we do. This dictates where we're at. I just came back from a financial conference in Texas where I got to meet a lot of my counterparts. It's easier for them to do their budget because they've got broad-based state taxes. There's only 2 states that don't have an income tax or a sales tax. That's Alaska and that's New Hampshire. There's only 1 state that has neither a sales tax, an income tax, or a property tax. That's Alaska. New Hampshire has excessively high property tax at the state level at almost 17 mils. And then it grows up from there. And so we actually need to figure this out. Where we're in Alaska, this is where our revenue comes from, is the resource development side as well as the investment earnings. And so as we look at this, it is an ongoing iterative process as we develop the current year budget using current year revenues, which is very, very different from every other state. They can look at and anticipate the historical return. So this is something we've actually modeled. We've had internal conversations on what if we did a smoothing effect for the budget development process. over time. It's a complicated thing to get around for a lot of the general public, but I think it's something we need to bring out because the POMV was a brand new aspect when it was first introduced to the public 3 years ago. How long ago was that now? I'm looking, you're there.
I want to say 5.
Was it 5 now? Yeah, 2018. And so that one, right, we've grown to become used to what that is and what that smoothing effect looks like and predictability that it brings.
We also before that, did the smoothing effect of the dividend.
Yes. So that's the primary on the fiscal outlook side. I've got more on kind of long-term economic development projects, and I didn't know if we wanted to kind of have questions and discussion now.
I can speak loud. I've been just watching the volume, and I know summertime is maintenance time, but it does seem to be lower than I would have expected. If anybody, usually somebody starts looking at that very hard.
Yeah, so the ERG group does look at that along with DNR on how that compares into what they anticipated. I actually can't speak much of the daily production part. I can put on the spot. If Stickle, you're on, if you want to actually speak up on that.
I think I've always asked you this question. Yeah, Stickle, you can go ahead and unmute if you'd like to respond to that question.
Sure, can you hear me now?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Dan Stickle with Revenue. So summer is a typical maintenance season, so seeing a little bit of a slowdown in production this time of year is pretty typical. We are beginning the process, as Commissioner mentioned, working with Department of Natural Resources of reaching out to the various oil companies and starting the process of preparing the fall production forecast. So once a year, we reach out to all of them, and we'll have a much better handle on the production outlook when we release that revenue forecast in December.
I'm going to follow up.
That's okay. I'll repeat it for the time.
I want to follow up real quick. Production forecasting is something that Commonwealth North has looked at quite extensively in years past. We have, Commissioner Ray, thanks for coming today. We've struggled with forecasting, especially on the production side. Now, on the price side, we don't know what's going to happen. Production, we should be able to have a much better idea. But over the years, dating back to the early 80s, as long as we have been forecasting production, and wildly optimistic, I thought, just to wrap it out, to see maybe once or twice. So, most of the time, so now, of course, oil is not nearly as important to us as it was. But it's still 23%. But taking that lesson and applying it to investment forecast, hopefully we can move forward and be able to better with our investment forecast what we have demonstrated in years past with our budget. So maybe not so much of a question there as a comment.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I know that we do a lot of risk analysis when we do from the ERG side. When we put forward either the numbers in or the price, we'll hear a number from a producer and they put forward what an initial well will do. They actually will de-risk that over time based upon multiple factors. And that's a nice job. Why we've got all economists on right now, they like to actually listen to all perspectives. When we look at the long term on the investment side, those numbers seem to have been hitting pretty well. Right. The one thing that does change over time in the current year is statutory net income. That's an item that actually adjusted greatly from the governor's budget that was presented last December until when it was officially announced in like April. Those numbers change because it depends upon the certain items that come in during the year during that time frame, as opposed to your long-term investment return. marry that up, what we do from the investment side is also really look at how the Department of Revenue and Treasury is working with the permanent fund court. And so we try to time that overall. Because we make sure the earnings reserve is still invested at the same asset allocation level as the principal of the permanent fund. And so this is an item that we want to make sure that when the POV is scheduled to occur, it doesn't just happen and then sit. Because once we get this and it's just the general fund or the CBR, Constitutional Budget Reserve, it's just invested at cash equivalents. We have to keep that very neutral so it's liquid at all times. And so we time that up. So we've actually done 2 major POV draws already in anticipation of the dividend as well as just government operations. We have it scheduled out over a couple of months. Like every couple of months, there's a new draw with a bulk coming in June. We're trying to keep as much invested for as long as possible to get the most return over time. And so as we look at all this stuff, we do know the POV, we kind of stress test that a little bit back and forth, not only with the Permanent Fund Corp, but with our investment advisors of Callan, as well as the ERG group continues to look at it. So we're pretty confident in those numbers.
Just a follow-up, if I may. Since we, in the last 5 years, we have been drawing out of the savings account investment. Maybe this is a question that's better directed to permanent fund people. I don't know. I'm curious as to whether or not our investment strategy has changed. Because of the timing of the draws for that next year.
So I can actually respond to that. As a trustee, we've had that conversation as well. And no, the answer from the chief investment officer is no. He actually tries to look at, knowing that there was always going to be this range of dollar amount events over time, looking at when liquidity events are going to occur, other alternatives, either in sale of property or when equities are going to do it. And so he really does have a good eye on knowing that we have to have cash. And when we talked about that, and we just did our risk allocation, I believe, in the May meeting for the permanent fund, that it does not change the overall strategy. We actually set this based upon the risk parameters, trying to get what we're shooting for an optimized return over time, as well as how is the overall risk tolerance, how does this fit in the overall market, and then they present that in multiple meetings, and then we actually have that balanced against our investment advisors, and they tell us the overall plan. So that actually was a direct question that happened back in February. Does this actually affect knowing that we're going to have this big cash flow? And no, because a lot of endowment principles are designed like this over time to make sure that they're doing this 4 to 5% draw on an annual basis.
So, related to all that, a couple of months ago, there was a little dust up about comments that Devin Mitchell had made about looking forward that there could be a day when the fund didn't have enough earnings to pay out the POMV amount. So can you clarify what that meant?
Yeah, so
That means?
Really there's 2 big holes or drains on the earnings reserve account. As earnings are realized and then deposited into the earnings reserve, we have both the POMV and we also have the inflation proofing aspect from the legislature, which is an intentional thing. We missed that for a couple of years, but the legislature's been trying to regain back on that to keep the principal safe. Those are the 2 big things that can actually affect that. With our earnings reserve, and this is something that they did a really good job last week. I would actually recommend the members to do this. We actually had 5 hours of meetings on this, just on the earnings reserve, the likelihood of it actually being diminished over time, and setting it up. I believe the official number from Callan was a 25% likelihood that by 2030, the earnings reserve could have some issues. And so that's, that is in the near term. So it's something we do have to look at and think about. So that's something to really watch. I'm not going to speak on it. I'm not an expert fully because it's such a big, massive subject. I don't want to misspeak. But that was something that we have spent hours on. We actually are having a lot more of these trustee papers written on this to put out for the overall public consumption.
Thank you.
Better.
Commissioner, is the administration going to propose a constitutional amendment this coming session?
I don't know about that. So when we put forward our items, so the Department of Revenue, we haven't put that forward. That would typically be a Gov Office derived item. A lot of the times in the Gov Office, and we know about a week before you do, when the items get forward on the legislative items, that these are the things we're going that discussion. I imagine we may have some more conversations now that we have an OMB director in place, but I don't know for sure.
Have you spoken to the governor if he's supportive of the idea of combining the corpus and the ERA?
A long time ago, not recently.
I know it's something the trustees have pushed for a long time.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you, Commissioner.
Just remind folks online, if you'd like to ask a question, please either raise your hand and wait for me to call on you, or you can type it.
Hey, any other questions on that? Want to proceed?
Appreciate the question.
And by the way, Eric Wolford was co-chair of this for many years also, and Commonwealth North has taken a position for an endowment. Okay. Sherry.
One of the principles of the Permanent Fund Corp.
Yes.
Yes, I'm sure you've all read David Rose's book. What a great read. So a couple items we just wanted to touch on going forward, like where does Alaska's kind of prospects sit, is we did a really concerted effort this year to change how we market and talk about Alaska to outside investor groups and to credit rating agencies and to banks. And so we wanted to make sure that we kind of got out of this general malaise of, oh, we've had 10 years without migration, we've had declining industries, and we try to change it to where we're telling the good news story. I do appreciate the legislature supporting us this year by actually giving money to the Department of Commerce to really work and focus on this item as well. So examples coming up, we've got the Willow Project, right? When that comes through, that's going to be 180,000 barrels a day. It's got some legal items going forward. We did have a major step, a good win. It's in process again. We did work on an early financial analysis for this, which was used when we had our rural caucus actually fly to DC and speak on some of the steps. And so what I'm going to share, actually, these are public numbers. This is a public analysis that we did put out. And we worked directly with Conoco. So we actually worked with Caroline and team, and they actually looked at this and gave the okay to share what some of the numbers look like over time. And so what this does to show is the CapEx profile as well as the production profile, and then the cumulative year to date, as well as when it becomes cash flow positive, right? Cash flow positive to the state, not till 2030 because of some of the other aspects we've got going on. But the impact to communities is immediate. Right, as soon as they actually start work, they get this. Because this is in National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, it's federal land, the primary beneficiaries are going to be the federal government and the local communities. And so this is an item that is of the utmost importance to our North Slope communities for this project. The PICA project, which is a combination of Santos and Repsol, we did get to FID in August of 20. What years ago? 22, August of 22. We talked about these projects for a lot of us. We've talked about these things for like 10 or 15 years. And so when they actually came to their FID, we're trying to figure it out. So yeah, $2.6 billion project. This one is all on state land. The unique aspect on this is the pretty conventional play, and they're able to actually extract quite a bit of oil from minimal amount of wells. And so we're very excited about this because they also just had approved this year by Department of Natural Resources 2 other units which are owned by Repsol and Santos, and that's the Horseshoe and the Quokka units. Neat thing about Santos is where they've sent their entire board up to Alaska, they've spent time. They are committed to a net zero project. And so the carbon offset bill, which the governor put forward and the legislature approved, actually allows an opportunity for them to buy into Alaska's carbon offset plan and program over time. It helps them with their net zero goals. And so this is another thing that we can actually continue to work together as we look at a lot of these items. A lot of jobs created, 2,600 jobs and more than 500 long-term jobs created. We don't have a public analysis on this project yet, so I can't give you the CapEx profile and other things. But it's beneficial to the state. I can say that because it is on state land. We get both royalties and production taxes. The North Slope Borough is a major beneficiary, so we're very excited for this project to continue moving. The gas line has been an ongoing thing for longer than I've been alive. But we look at how items have come about, and you look at the history of taps. And, right, depends on a lot of world events help determine how these things launch. And so where we're at here has really changed the mindset of the value of where countries get their gas. Not only that, in the last 2 years, we've seen a massive transition in the mindset of what we need to get to renewables. And so at the Governor's Sustainable Energy Conference last May, we actually had an undersecretary for the Department of Energy. We had an undersecretary for the Department of State all stand up there about saying the energy transition is a very long time. We need natural gas for the next 30 to 50 years. And the reason is, why the United States has actually been able to decrease its carbon footprint since 2019 has actually been using natural gas to replace coal. When you look at the world's economies, China's down an anticipated 17%, but you look at the rise now, the world's largest population is in India. Africa is the world's youngest population, and they're at 1 billion. They're going to grow and to rise. And so we need to access natural gas reserves in order to bring these economies online in a safe manner, which is why there's a long-term need for natural gas. And we know what we have on the North Slope. We have 43 trillion cubic feet of known reserves up there. We cycle 8 billion cubic feet on a daily basis back into the reserves. So we know the gas there, we know the molecules, they've been counted. We've got a lot more beyond that in extra plates, right? We talked about Willow, we talked about Picca. We haven't even done analysis on the available gas. But then those things after we actually extract the liquids. This is how the Alaska, we're very blessed in our resource basins and how they're set up. We actually have a good mixture of both. And so as we move ahead, we got some fantastic things, thanks to Senator Murkowski. She did a really good job, and Senator Sullivan have been huge proponents, and they were successful in getting $30 billion loan guarantee for the gas line project. And I can't remember if it was IIJ or IRA. It was IRA. And so not only that, we also have 35 permits. On top of that, with our FERC permit, the FERC permit has been defended in court by FERC and the Department of Energy and sustained. We actually have a record of decision. The most latest lawsuit is on the Export Authority, but where that's filed at is actually being defended again by the Department of Energy on the work that they've done in federal court in Washington, D.C. And so this project is set and ready to go. We've had fantastic conversations with interested buyers and investors that have flown to the state to look at this, as well as setting up the overall cost, power, and structure of the project. It is a massive project, anticipated at $44 billion investment on the capital raise. Each of the three projects by themselves would be some of the largest engineering projects in the world. So I say that because there's a carbon capture project up north, there's a gas line about 800 miles, and then there's a liquefaction on the south end. What sets this project apart is our location in the world. It's 7 days from Nikiski to Japan to export LNG. That is actually different than the Gulf Coast, which is 17 days. And so you look at the time factor, you remove transportation costs out of the cost power. So therefore, the tolling side actually becomes not as cost prohibitive over time. On top of that, because of the way the project's designed and permitted with the carbon capture on the North Slope, and it'd be re-injected underground, it would actually be considered a low carbon natural gas, which is a thing. And that actually helps Japan and Korea, who've got very robust 2050 climate goals, to actually meet those needs. So this is another item. We've got the carbon offset bill, but we do have SB 50, which is still up in the legislature being contemplated, which allows the carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And so this is the next step in order for us to actually take this and re-inject it underground, and actually, on top of that, get financial benefit from the federal government in the 45Q tax credit at $85 a ton. And so we've got this added benefit of making a low-carbon product. And as this continues to proceed, it is very exciting. Here's a nice thing on the proximity. 20 days. I shorted it. And so 7 days for us. We're even closer than Australia, which is 10 days. And when you look at the highlighted hotspot on the Australia route, that actually means it's questionable with troubled waters between some of the nations they'll actually have to go through, whereas we've got essentially a protected route from Alaska all the way there. So I really appreciate this. We stole this because we had a map up, but it wasn't as neat as this. We stole this from Senator Sullivan because his graphics guys did a great job.
So, question here.
Yes, sir.
If you're saying the market in the next 20, 30 years is India, Africa, that really adds another 17 days for our gas to get to that market.
So what I was mentioning India and Africa for was actually for the Africa side. That means that there's when we talk about new projects coming online in the Gulf Coast, they actually have a market directly across the Atlantic. meaning that they don't have to fight for us on the market share on the Pacific side. If that makes sense. Because the need that Japan and Korea has is going to increase for that. The overall, we're calling it the wedge, the necessary need for the gas is growing.
Does the recent difficulties with the Panama Canal, the fact that they have a severe drought down there, plus the relative uncertainties about getting through the canal, does that affect the project?
It does. That's why there's the hot spot on the Panama Canal map here, is because that 20 days is kind of the best case scenario for them getting through. We haven't done an analysis on the recent droughts, but we've had about the overall holdups that can occur because of the current ownership of the Panama Canal has been a part of the analysis.
How far is Qatar?
It's 16 days from, 16 days for them to get to Korea. Yeah. So it's one of those things, it's always neat to look where Alaska actually sits in the world. And there's a reason why we've been able to use our geostrategic location over time, along with Ted Stevens' gift of cabotage, in order to grow our air cargo to become the third busiest air cargo hub in the world. And so we're 9.5 hours from most of the developed world, like over 90% in the Northern Hemisphere. And so no other city can actually claim that because of our pole shots. So we do have a lot of stakeholder support to the delegation, to the state, as well as in the Biden administration. They've actually been fantastic supporters of this. Rahm Emanuel, the ambassador to Japan, is actually one of the biggest cheerleaders of this when he looks at what it's going to do over time. It was nice having federal representation at the governor's conference in May to actually kind of reiterate. On top of that, I know some people are excited in here. They actually did say they need federal permitting reform on the federal side. So that is another thing that we hope we get some items on. So keep pushing them, Layla. And so part of the execution strategy, just being brief on this, is all the work has been done and consolidated in the Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation. Once we actually get to the idea of who's going to be the lead investors in FEED, which is $150 million, it's the strategic investor that knows how to build LNG lines, that has the confidence of the market, both for the investor side as well as the buyers, in order to come in. That's actually the hardest part right now, is getting that strategic lead investor out there. The capital raise on the $44 billion is not as difficult as you think. One of the reasons is the dry capital we have post 2021. The amount the market increased in 2020 and 2021, and then actually has not, the number of IPOs or initial public offerings, is so far diminished from what it was in 21 and 22. There is a lot of capital on the sidelines and people looking to deploy it. And part of their long-term de-risk strategy is owning infrastructure like this in private income. So we've talked about the carbon offsets, SB 48, AOGCC. Part of SB 48 and the carbon offsets, a very important critical aspect, was to give the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission permission to pursue Class 6 well primacy from the EPA. It's a 2-year process. We're the third state to actively pursue that. That was a massive bell-ringing event for investors worldwide when it looks at the overall CCUS, or carbon capture, utilization, and storage. That actually signified Alaska is serious about looking at these items over time. And we have had a lot of very good conversations with the very big banks, Goldman Sachs, Guggenheim, that want to come and bring money to Alaska. Talk about the storage potential, U.S. The nice thing is this is a map. Really just shows all of the gigaton storage potential. 1,600 tons, some of it inaccessible because it's offshore. 200 gigatons is what we anticipate. We were given by an analyst for our storage potential. 50 gigatons is available in Cook Inlet that we know of. This is for storage. And I think that is all of the carbon produced by Japan in 50 years is about 50 gigatons. Getting a nod from my team. The exciting thing is, if we do get gas line, and we're doing this agnostically, right? We've got multiple fronts. The gas line is nice because we've got the energy transition projects overall. It changes about the low carbon LNG. It changes about the CCUS and the other things. It actually makes things like e-fuels possible. The governor has us exploring a lot of other stuff when it comes to hydrogen, wind, and geothermal. There is so much across the board that we are looking to do, and partnering with our friends at USGS and Department of Energy, into doing mapping of our geothermal aspects. Because a lot of Alaska being off the road system, they're not going to have access to gas. The rail belt, though, right? 3/4 of the state's population will have this. We'll be able to drop the kilowatt hour in the interior a drastic amount. Right now, the average estimate on mass is about 5/8 the cost per BTU at this point in time. So that's a pretty tremendous aspect. And you look at where Fairbanks is overall with their air quality issues, this would be massive boom to the interior of Alaska in order to do this. Particularly, it's a holdup in housing costs, cost of living aspect, and it actually limits our military deploying fifth-gen fighters even more so, and their families and airmen to the interior of Alaska. We talked about the federal funding. There's just a lot of opportunities there. And I just want to talk about our credit profile. We actually worked very, very hard, and we spent a week in New York, and we got Crum Bond Rating Agency gave us a AA rating with a stable outlook. This is the highest state rating since 2017. It actually worked on the other ones. They're doing an updated analysis here this fall, and we hope to get some updated looks from them in January to increase where we're at. The reason why this is important is because Alaska, I highlighted it, they basically have $621 million in outstanding debt. We are the second lowest state behind Wyoming when it comes to overall bond debt. We also have had very low capital projects. We need to build something. And so this is something that we've had conversations with. I've had the benefit of traveling with legislators and having conversations about possible GEO bonds. And how do we put this forward to Alaskans? Because we have to have the GEO bonds, the budget process by the legislature, and then up to a vote of the people in the coming election. So this is something that as we do work on this and we get a package put together, I would actually look forward to coming to speak with these groups again to share what we're looking at, what we're pursuing, how this is beneficial to the state, and then following it through the legislative process. Because we can actually basically keep our we can keep the current $400 to $500 million capital appropriations aspect, but using that for debt servicing against billions of dollars of projects. And that's what we need to do for Alaska for the long term. We need to turn the corner to do some very direct things, because if we're doing it outside of federal process, it actually means we can jump ahead a little bit further. We don't necessarily have to do NEPA up front. We have our own internal state, very high level standard environmental process, but we can move faster on key projects to the state. So this is an important process that we're going to talk about. Again, this is the governor's discretion to put forward, or if the legislatures to do so. But we're kind of working on this and having conversations on what this would look like to benefit Alaska. So with that, I just want to say thank you. I appreciate you guys having me here today and let me geek out.
Well, let's talk about Medicaid.
Please no. I just froze for a second.
Okay, any other questions?
Good. You were at the Air Board today?
Yeah.
And they come out with their annual statement, and we know where we are as far as our unfunded liability.
The unfunded liability, so I should have off the top of my head. It's like 140% overfunded on the health side. The retirement side, 80-ish. I can actually fire that to Annetta.
Yeah.
Because it just came out today. It was public, but I make sure I pull that from the document that you can see that and share. We also did put forward a recommendation for we want the state to actually pay into it. And so for the health side, it's a zero funding aspect. On the pension side, we put a request for the legislature.
Yeah, the health side, because last couple of years, health has been highly subsidized and actually done well, but they have their forecast.
It's still holding strong. Part of the ongoing kind of thought process, we had a public member testify yesterday who asked us to look at perhaps even with it being overfunded, should we start putting money in up front in order to make sure it stays stable due to the rising cost of healthcare and the aging population. And so it was really good conversation around that, and it'll be interesting to see where we go. I'm excited about getting the pension gap closed quite a bit more. It's nice that the health side of the state.
But I mean, 80% is actually very healthy.
Oh, it's exceptionally healthy.
So I mean, I would hate to have the state looking over something.
Correct. It's not the overfunding aspect. It's about kind of like the annual contribution to make sure we steadily build.
But I hate to get overfunded.
You mentioned that we have one of the lowest debt levels in any state, but when you look at it on a per capita basis, I think we rank fourth
And so can you speak to a little bit about how, what is the calculus the administration might use to navigate those two numbers to maintain a reasonable balance?
Yeah. So it's important to look at what is outstanding debt for the state versus outstanding debt that's in communities, because a lot of communities have their own bonding capacity and capability. And so we look at this just on what is the state GL, as we look at what are Alaskans paying for that. And knowing about the state dollars coming in, we're not taxing Alaskans essentially. What can we use on our resources to really help that over time for the GO side? That's how we kind of anticipate that. When it comes to the overall outlook, I mean, that's more of a local discussion. One of the things that we're trying to do is, because the state debt manager is within the Department of Revenue, is working with communities. We'll have some communities that have a very high credit rating, but because of lack of infrastructure, they'll go through the municipal bond bank, which has a lower credit rating than they do, and accept a higher rate. We're trying to figure out what's that gap. How can we actually help them so they don't do that, so we get cheaper dollars in the community? And what are some things that they can do? So you may notice that I've got a lot more staff than normal. The Department of Revenue is historically had a very lean commissioner's office. Part of the goal of taking on this role, the governor wanted me to help kind of be the aggregator for durable economic development over time. It's still a primary mission of the Department of Commerce. But one of the things is I have the benefit of being the tax man, even though we don't really tax it, but if the guy who controls corporate income tax calls, I'm able to get meetings. And so it's to use the public for convening authority to have conversations, to find out what we're doing over time. We collect information. What are the barriers to manufacturing? What are the other barriers to transportation? And sharing that to the appropriate departments. And this is how we've been using the Department of Revenue for that, which is why we've got policy staff. And we're really trying to dive into, as opposed to just the status quo, how do we grow? Not to grow the government. How do we grow the state? How do we get more people in here over time? How do we increase wages across the board? And it's just making sure that our local communities who don't have resources, we don't necessarily want them to staff up. But you know what? We have an incredibly talented group in our ERG within tax. How can we actually help this group and build this up a little bit to help local communities share our resources so they can actually do long-term modeling? How do we do tax increment financing? How do we do property abatement projects? And it's, again, nothing that the state can offer other than expertise and convening authority.
Can I do a follow-up? Yeah, actually, a few follow-ups real quickly. One of the challenges with economic development in Alaska is that we have a tax-free environment to begin with. And so a lot of developers come to state government, local government, and are looking for, what are you going to do to help prime the pump? And we don't have that tool in our toolbox. So how are you approaching those kinds of issues?
We've had a lot of conversations. This has been an ongoing thing for the governor for the last year since I took over this role. We've been meeting with national experts on this, like what do we have to offer? And we already talked about changing the story, changing how we do that to Alaska, as opposed to, oh man, we don't have anything to offer. It's more like, we don't tax you. Look what we don't do. You don't have to worry about a rebate. You don't have to worry about calculating. It actually decreases your overhead over time when dealing with the state. And that is how we've really changed our approach. And the things that we can control from the state level is focusing on livability. So the gov's been working on his People's First initiative. We're working on a Strong Families in Alaska thing in order to really focus on childcare. But what can the state do to actually really help this side of it to improve livability? Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, which my deputy commissioner sits on the board for, they're really been very, very active looking at gov projects on how do we actually get more Alaskans housed in Alaska? How do we build more units? How do we get more inventory? And so that's what the state can really do, is focus on the livability. How do we actually get better housing? How do we get cheaper energy? And how do we take care of your kids? Those are the three things. We can really focus on the livability. That's what the government can do to help overall. And this is where energy is a massive change. We have the chance to go to Iceland. It's fascinating when you go there because there are no trees. Nothing. They're cut down hundreds of years ago. Kind of barren, it's a rock, but they've got massive structures because they've got really good geothermal across the board. And when you're paying 3 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour, it's amazing what you don't have to worry about. And so they build massive structures and they cover for their swimming pools, for their soccer teams, for their basketball groups. It's an amazing prospect what cheap energy can do and allow you to do in a like environment. They're latitude 62, same as Anchorage, and they're in the North Atlantic. And so it's a like climate. So this is something that we can look at. How do we get better, cheaper energy over time? And it's not just the gas line. There's other projects that are being worked on through the Alaska Energy Authority to really get down that cost and work on the livability.
So one final follow-up on that is with the Alaska Budget Choices Project, at least in a couple of scenarios, we discussed the relationship between shared state and local taxes. And, Alaska has a history of being, with good reason, somewhat paternalistic in terms of creating those structures, but over time, then maybe they're not, local governments develop more capacity and develop their own local tax structures. Has there been any discussion about revisiting some of those issues?
Not that much. Well, most of what we're trying to look at right now is kind of partnering with communities. If some of them have issues with that, what do they need to actually make that stronger? We've actually had a really good relationship with AML when it comes to this and talking about what are the overall burdens. The legislature contemplated some tax items last year, so we've been meeting over the interim to say, okay, if items like this were to proceed hypothetically, how does this work? What is the order of operations for your tax side, right? Dan Fickle does a fantastic thing about order of operations for our gross tax. Or net tax. Absolutely, right? Because it looks like what do you hit at what side, but it's really important to know that. So we've actually had to talk. We don't do sales tax at the state level. I have no experts at the state level who've done sales or income tax. And so we've had these conversations with the local governments about how do they work? What are these barriers to make sure that we're even seeing that? So we don't want to come in and disrupt. We're trying to figure out how can we stabilize, partner, and grow. And that's been the conversations around that.
I don't mean this to be a singer, but there was an article on the paper this morning that NSTAR is supporting the state gas pipeline. And it was kind of opaque, I guess, the article. Any comments on what the governor's position is going to be on it in the state pipeline?
I can't speak to the governor on that. I do know, so myself and Commissioner Boyle, DNR, we are statutorily precluded from actually sitting on AGDC because he's the mineral rights manager and I'm in charge of the property tax side. We have been evaluating the Alaska gas line from those perspectives. And so we're pursuing that from that. I know that there was a comment AGDC wanted NSTAR to give them all the work product. I see that being kind of a tall, what we're trying to say, tough sell to give a state work product to a foreign-owned company.
Except if I don't know if you know the history, but actually NSTAR did all the original permitting and work. And that was in the billions of dollars, which then the state took over. So
yeah.
But anyway.
So I really don't know. I haven't had that conversation with them, but it is interesting. I think it just is very telling then about what we need to do to stabilize rail belt utilities in the near term, and then look towards what's the next. Because I remember this conversation 10, 12 years ago, like we were going to say that we were the risk of brownouts.
Right.
It seems like every 10 to 12 years this is an ongoing thing in cooking.
Okay, we have one other question online, and we'll take that as the last question. So, Commissioner, this is from Michael Finelli with Alaska Public Media. He's asking that you mentioned the $30 billion loan to the federal government, where we get a $14 billion dollars come from for the LNG project, and would that come out of the state budget? And can you elaborate on the funding that you'll request from the legislature to probably pay that back, that one over time? Over how much?
So it'd be fascinating. I would advise Michael to dive into that. It's not a loan from the federal government, it's a loan guarantee, which means that it de-risks it for debt servicing aspects for investment banks to actually provide funds on that accordingly. It actually helps them with their shareholders on such a large capital raise. The balance of the $14 billion will come directly from infrastructure funds. It's a private project. The primary finances of this are going to be the private sector, the way this project's been designed, and the anticipation of the permits.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks, Commissioner. Thank you very much. Thank you all for And again, we're going to continue to meet next week and to talk about our budget choices website report, finalize those so we can proceed in getting that updated. Juanetta, did you want to do a commercial?